Let's dive a little deeper into the topic of propagation by cuttings. Mostly here we'll be talking about stem cuttings. So as propagators, we need to collect and obtain the right material, meaning the right maturity of a stem cutting or leaf or root. And then as we're trying to propagate that tissue or that cutting from a mother plant, we need to provide the correct environment for that cutting to form roots and later shoots and leaves. So we want to induce adventitious formation of roots off of a cutting. So that's a new word, adventitious. That just means anything that arises from an unusual place. Roots growing out of a stem. Normally if you look at a tree, you don't see roots growing off the side above ground. The roots are all underground. They grow out of the root crown, which is the very top of all the roots. So adventitious roots are roots that form off of the stem, and that's what we try to induce when we take a stem cutting. Roots can grow out of stem tissue from the nodes. Those are the places of growth on a stem where there is cell division, like the place where a leaf will grow from, or a new stem, or a flower, or a leaf bud. Again, new tissue is being developed at the node, and that is where the roots will grow out of if we do things right from our stem cutting. This is a picture of a woody twig with leaves and without leaves, showing you where the nodes are. Those are the places where the leaves grow out of, and little buds and other things. A lot of terminology on this slide. We're not going to go over all of it. But the terminal bud is the bud at the very tip of the stem. Axillary buds are further back down the stem, and they appear between the leaves and the stem. And both of those, the buds and the leaves, they come out of the node where cell division is happening to create new tissues and new plant organs. And when we take a cutting from something like this, we'll usually take a cutting. The bottom of the cutting will be right below a node, so when we stick that part in the media, roots can form more readily out of that node. A little more detail on how adventitious roots are formed off of stem cuttings. You first take your stem cutting, and that stem tissue can form those roots from these adventitious buds that are dormant within the stem tissue just below the bark. Those buds are dormant normally until we take a cutting and give it proper conditions like the heat and some moisture and sometimes the rooting hormone too, and those normally dormant buds become activated, and they push out these little pieces of tissue called root primordia. They're just early roots, and they start to grow roots from that what was once stem tissue. You can see one in the bottom right corner of that image. That's the root primordia starting to divide and make roots off of what was a stem tissue. Propagation by stem cuttings requires only that new adventitious root systems be formed, since the shoot system is already present. You took a stem off of a plant and tried to get roots to form on one end, the bottom end. And by the way, when you do take stem cuttings, sometimes when you're doing really long stems or vines, you can almost forget which way was down, what was the bottom portion of your cutting. So you do have to remember that and stick that bottom part into the media, not the top part. It really doesn't work if you stick it in upside down. De-differentiation occurs, and that's where these cells, like in your stem cutting, there are cells in there that, to them, they are a stem cell, from a cell, not the stem cell like the research on stem cells, but a cell from the stem of a plant, and they lose that identity and go back to become a meristematic cell, which means it's like what we call stem cells. It's a cell that can become any other type of cell. So it has not yet gotten its role or identity. So you have, imagine a cutting from a stem. You've got a branch of a plant, and you take a cutting. All the cells in that branch already have become specialized to become different parts of that branch. Either they're bark, or they are the vascular tissue, or the center or a leaf, etc. But when you take the cutting and induce it to form roots, the things, those primordia, actually go from being a stem type of cell to a root primordia. So they change. That's what differentiation means. It goes from being differentiated or with a clear role to no role, and then back to being a root cell. So that's a lot more than you wanted to know, but that's the nitty-gritty of how this works. Here are a couple of dramatic examples of roots that are being formed off of stems, so adventitious roots. Corn plants have this. You can see these yellow, thick, adventitious roots forming above ground off of stem tissue, which is abnormal. Typically you'll have roots growing underground off of roots in the root crown. Here they're forming off of the stem tissue. That's why they're called adventitious. And the function in corn, these grow out and grow down into the soil, and they pull the corn stalk down deeper, and they're like anchoring the plant. So they're for stabilization of that long, skinny, tall corn stalk. The bottom one, it looks like a kapok tree, a tropical tree, and these buttress roots are actually roots growing off of the trunk, which is stem tissue. And again, this is a way for this plant to stabilize itself. Tropical soils are typically very thin. You'd think they're thick, but they're actually quite thin, because whenever leaves and things fall to the ground in a hot tropical environment, they become composted quickly and they get sucked back up into the biomass of living plants. So the soils do not develop and get deep and rich. They're usually pretty thin, and plants like this, tall trees, need a wide base to stabilize themselves in such soils. Where exactly do these new roots, these adventitious roots, originate in the stem cutting? Well, we said through the root primordia. That's kind of looking at the anatomical cellular level when we say root primordia. But a little bit broader scale, those in herbaceous plants, plants that do not get woody brown tissue but stay green, those adventitious roots form between the vascular tissue, which is called phloem, and xylem. Those are the system of pipes that moves sugars and waters around inside of a plant. They form like where that red circle or red oval is with the arrow pointing to it. So between that vascular tissue and the epidermis. So that's where the roots come out of in herbaceous plants. Perennial plants that do get woody and brown, those roots, those adventitious roots, form within the vascular bundle where the phloem and the xylem is, particularly the phloem cells usually, and push out towards the outer edge of that stem and then grow out to become true roots. Here are some examples of adventitious roots that form in normal development, not from cuttings. On the top part of the graph you're looking at, or the image, embryonic roots in dicots, sometimes called eudicots, there are primary roots and junction roots. Those lateral roots that are shown as in blue are considered adventitious roots. In the center top part of the image are these adventitious roots that are called brace roots, and they are roots that are forming off of the stem tissue and reaching down into the soil, and that looks like a corn plant. And then we have nodal roots, roots that are forming off of the stem of this strawberry plant, and those are coming out of the nodes where the leaves grow out of. The bottom part of this image is showing you examples of adventitious roots that are a result of stress response. So we have in box D, it's showing you roots that are forming off the stems of this little plant as a result of low light. And then the middle one, intact roots, flooded stems sometimes will grow roots off of the stem, and wounded stems will grow roots off of them. That last one, that box F, is like what we're going to be doing, cutting induced roots, adventitious roots that are forming off of a stem. So cuttings, many plants can be propagated from either the tips of stems or back a little ways, the stem itself, or from root or from leaf cuttings. Generally, stem tip cuttings are the best ones to propagate and get roots to grow rather than taking cuttings of the roots or even the leaves. So stem tips tend to be your best bet if you're looking at, in general, the best way to get cut stems to grow roots on them for propagating species. Continuing on with some of the basics of using cuttings for propagation. Conserve the stock plant or the mother plant or the parent plant. You've got a bush or a tree and you want to take cuttings off of it to propagate more. Don't take more than 20% of the overall biomass of that parent mother plant for your cuttings. And if you take that amount below 20%, most plants will recover well from this within a year. So you can take cuttings every 6 months possibly, or every year, and the plant, your stock plant, grows back to its original size within that time period, so it's never getting diminished over time. Also, always use good hygiene related to the tools you're using for propagation. Use clean, sterilized tools. Of course, we don't want to spread pathogens using the tools. Sharp tools, so the sharper your clippers are, or grafting knives, the cleaner the wound is and the less surface area it has, which means it has less surface area for pathogen transmission. So good clean cuts with sharp tools are important for propagation. Always use sterile growing media. If you're doing this in large quantities, you want to propagate and make sure you're going to get enough new plants in a given period of time. You don't want to mess with your media being contaminated and having the loss of some of your cuttings or small seedlings due to a pathogen infested media. So purchase and use sterile growing media if you're doing this as a profession. And when you're looking at all your cuttings as they're growing roots, wherever you have them in a greenhouse or a hothouse, and you're getting them up to speed, getting their maturity up so they can survive outside, you want to remove any cuttings that show signs of disease or desiccation. Take those out right away and compost them far from where you're going to be using them. Also, take cuttings when plants are not in flower. When the plants are in flower, they're putting a lot of energy towards producing those flowers, and they will not rebound as well to being clipped and cut and pruned. Of course, some plants don't care. You can cut them anytime. You can cut them all the way to the ground. They're always going to grow back. But for plants that are a little more sensitive, you want to make sure you don't take cuttings from them when they're in flower. And as I said earlier, the types of cuttings, stem tips tend to be the most successful in general, but you can also take stem cuttings, and there's also a cutting called a basal stem cutting. With your stem cuttings, in addition to checking your cuttings after you've taken them and put them in their media and they start to grow a little bit of roots, check them for disease and desiccation, like I said in the last slide, but also check them for pests. If you see aphids starting to show up on them, or you see other things like ants. If you've got ants, then you definitely have aphids, because the ants like to farm the aphids on your cuttings once they get some green material like leaves. So check for that too. And if you see them infested, take those cuttings out, take them out of the greenhouse or hothouse, and get rid of them, compost them. The lower cut of a stem cutting is made just below a node, and it's usually done at a 45-degree angle. And that's the place where the natural auxins, those hormones, are more active and will induce greater root initiation than if you made the lower cut pretty far from the node. You can use long stems for multiple cuttings. Take 4 to 8 inch long cuttings from maybe a 2 or 3 foot stem that you took off of a parent plant. Usually you remove most of the leaves from the bottom portion of the stems, the part that's going to go under the media. And the top cut, you cut just above a leaf, and the bottom cut is just below a leaf. And usually the top cut is completely horizontal, and the bottom cut is at a 45-degree angle. So the bottom cut's at a 45-degree angle to give you more surface area for more roots to come out of. And the top is cut flat just so you can remember which way is the top of the cutting, and it helps that have the top and the bottom cut differently. Then you can remember the tops are flat and the bottoms are at an angle. Stem cuttings can be taken from 4 different types of maturity of wood on a perennial plant. Softwood are the very tips of the stems. Greenwood is just back down a little ways from the tip of the branch, just below the softwood. Semi-ripe, the stem is starting to be firm up, get harder and browner, and ripe is fully brown, hardened, woody tissue. Softwood cuttings are taken from the first flush of new growth in the spring. The stems are slimmer and kind of floppy compared to semi-ripe. If you bend them, they don't really snap because they just don't have any hard tissues in there to break. You can crush them easily if pinched. That's softwood. Greenwood, just starting to firm up. Stems are a little firmer, not as floppy as the softwood. If you bend them, they do snap and they crush easily using your thumbnail. For greenwood cuttings, take 3 to 5 inches below the shoot tip, just below the node, and these do root quickly because they're very green and they were part of the mother plant that was growing quickly. Softwood and greenwood are very susceptible to rotting even though they root quickly, rather than semi-ripe and ripe, which do not rot quickly. One of the forms of rot is pythium, it's a crown rot, and verticillium is a wilt. Those are both fungal problems that can make your cuttings die. Sow cuttings to be dipped in rooting hormone, and often the rooting hormone has a fungicide in it too to prevent more of loss of your cuttings from these 2 diseases. A pretty good list of plants that require softwood cuttings for really successful rooting. You can check that out or just use it as a reference. All kinds of online information like this. If you want to look something up, you want to propagate a certain plant, you can find out like the best maturity of wood to take cuttings from for propagation, or find out if it doesn't respond well to cuttings at all. Maybe something else. Maybe some plants do better from seed. So there's all kinds of info. I grabbed this list off of the internet, so there's many more like that out there. A basal stem cutting is taken from certain types of plants, more herbaceous. Herbaceous means non-woody, so green, more succulent and soft. Something like in the picture, the bottom right picture is a begonia. But some plants respond well to being propagated by these types of cuttings. It's when you take the stem of or a branch of a plant and you cut it all the way back to where it joins with the next bigger branch, and you take some of the tissue from that next bigger branch also, so that the entire shoot or branch with a piece of the parent tissue, that older tissue from the next biggest branch that it's attached to, cut at the base. And you trim off all the leaves, just like with all other cuttings. The leaves that are going to go underground, you cut most of the leaves off the top except for maybe one or even a half of a leaf left, and you root it just like you would any other cutting, and it tends to do better when it has some of that tissue from that parent branch that it was attached to. They produce stronger shoots and active growth and quick to root. Some of the plants that respond well to basal stem cuttings are salvias, like in the upper left picture. That salvia is called Salvia hot lips. It's a cultivar that has red and white flowers. And we used to have a lot more of it on campus, and because City College's colors are red and white, this was nicknamed the Vaquero salvia by some people on campus. Phlox, asters, delphiniums, violas, those all are plants that are propagated very easily from basal stem cuttings. And these produce more mature plants more quickly than if you did it through other methods. this is an image of someone taking a basal stem cutting, and you can see how they're cutting into the tissue of the branch that that stem is attached to, and some of that base tissue, the basal tissue that's right around the bottom of the actual cutting that you're going to use to propagate. Semi-ripe cuttings, those are taken from shoots in active growth, this season's active growth, but not the newest growth, not like the softwood or greenwood, but they're in vigorous growing condition. The wood is harder than softwood and greenwood. Usually it is getting a little bit browner or reddish. When bent, it will snap with some of the bark still adhering. It's not as subject to decay as much as softwood and greenwood, but it also will not root as well. Often the semi-ripe wood is 1 year old wood, not the very newest growth, but from last year. And to take the cuttings is a good time to take them is later in the spring than you would the hardwood. Basal parts beginning to ripen. Again, this is a repeat, but if it's bent, it won't snap. You can crush it easily. And they need protection from cold to root well, but they're hardier, and rooting takes longer, 4 to 8 weeks, than if you're using greenwood. Hardwood, it's the hardest type of wood found on a plant, usually more than a year old, taken from perennial plants, trees, shrubs, deciduous plants, broadleaf evergreens, conifers. They all have hardwood. Cuttings can be taken from them. There's a straight type of cutting, a heel cutting, which looks similar to a basal cutting, but it's for a woody plant. The basal cuttings are for herbaceous, non-woody plants, and a mallet cutting. All three of these have their ways of maximizing exposure of the cambium, that's the vascular tissue just inside the bark, that from which those root primordia or adventitious roots will form. So the hardwood straight cutting you see on the left of the image, that has the 45-degree angle cut, that has a higher surface area than if you cut it flat at the bottom. So it increases the potential for roots to form, and it also helps you remember which way is the bottom of the cut if the top was also a cutting. The heel cut is like I said, it's like the basal cutting on herbaceous plants, but it has a little bit of that tissue from the parent stem that cutting was taken from. Mallet has a bigger chunk, about an inch long piece of the parent branch that the cutting was taken from, and this also is a method of increasing the exposure of the cambium for more roots to come out on both ends of that little mallet. Certain plants do well with these mallet cuttings. The only reason we know that is from trial and error. Things like ceanothus are done almost primarily through mallet cuttings, and they work pretty well, whereas with the straight cutting they won't. So go figure. But this is what propagators do, is they just trial and error, figure out which methods of cuttings or propagation work best for which species. For deciduous plants, the hardwood cuttings are those plants that lose their leaves naturally in the wintertime. And you want the cuttings to be taken when that plant is completely dormant and all the leaves have fallen off. And you want your cutting to be long enough to include at least 2 nodes. Kind of the rule of thumb is 2 or 3 nodes below the ground and 2 or 3 above ground when you take your cutting and put it in the media to root it in. You want those 2 or 3 nodes to be underground or 2 or 3 to be above ground. So it needs to be sizable. You know, with a hardwood cutting, usually they're about 6 to 12 inches long, depending on how many nodes in that length. Some things like grapevines, which are hardwood cuttings that you use, their nodes can be 8 inches apart. So you can only get 2 nodes on one 8 to 10 inch cutting. So it really depends on the species, as we say for a lot of these methods. You can take hardwood cuttings and bundle them up and keep them in a moist bag or bed of sand until they form a callus. And a callus is something that forms on the cut ends of these cuttings, where the cut end is exposing the cambium, the little moisture inside the root, and that will kind of scab over time. And once they've kind of dried out and scabbed over or calloused, they can be stored for even longer before rooting them. Hardwood cuttings do best when they are given bottom heat, like put on a heating pad of about 75 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit. That means that temperature induces the most root growth in most of the cuttings. A little bit more on heel cuttings. This is used for lots of woody perennials. It's taken from new growth or this year's growth, branches away from the stem sideways, and some of that tissue is used. And the base of the stem is naturally formed when the branch is pulled firmly. So a sliver of older wood and bark comes away with the stem. You trim the heel about a half an inch, reduce the leaf area, dip in rooting hormone or rooting gel, place in perlite, something like perlite. Use about a 4 to 6 inch semi-ripe or hardwood cutting and plant about 1/2 to 2/3 of the stem underground. So this bottom half, once we get to reduce leaf area, that bottom list of the procedures is pretty much typical of most cuttings. The top part here is specific to heel cuttings. Sometimes heel cuttings are called pullings too, where you take a branch and you actually pull it off and it strips some of the bark at the bottom of that branch away. So you're getting some of the tissue in the bark from the parent branch, and then you cut that off part ways. That's a heel cutting. Cane cuttings are used with plants that form canes, thick-stalked perennials. A lot of tropical plants have canes. These are usually hollow or woody, slender jointed stems like bamboo, rattan, some grasses, sugar canes, sorghum, other grasses used in the South United States for fodder, for animal food, philodendron, tea plant, corn plant, Chinese evergreen, dumb plant. You're seeing a picture here of, looks like a philodendron or a tea cane. So the cane is just a name for the stems of those types of plants. And this is what they look like. And you've seen a lot of them in house plants. And you can take just little sections of the stem and just put them right into the potting media. Each of those little rings is where leaves were growing off of that plant, but those are considered nodes. So adventitious roots can form off of those rings. So as long as you got, half of that cutting underground or lying flat on the ground, roots will form off of those. Some other examples of cuttings. There's the cane cutting in the upper left. Upper right, the rhizome stem cutting. You can cut like an iris rhizome into sections and root those separately. You can see that in the lower left. And the bottom right, stem, a tuber like a potato or sweet potato. There's a lot of plants that produce tubers, and you can chop those up as long as they have one little, a potato, what we call an eye, that really is a node. Then those can be, each of those can grow into a whole new plant. Some examples of plants that produce canes. The corn plant is the common house plant Dracaena. One reason these Dracaenas are popular is because they require almost no light, indirect light or completely low light areas like in a bathroom with no windows, and they do well. They're adapted to very shady understory of tropical forests. And we've got Dieffenbachia and Chinese evergreen, also ones that produce canes that can be, cuttings can be taken from those canes and propagated in the way previously described. Some of the methods used for cane cuttings, a little more specific, is as long as you get a couple of those nodes or rings underground or touching the soil, they have high potential for producing the adventitious roots. Dust the ends of the cane with fungicide or activated charcoal to reduce fungal growth and disease. Allow them to dry for several hours, kind of callus over, You can lay them horizontally with about half of the cutting above the surface of the media and half below. And the cane cuttings are usually potted up when the roots and new shoots appear, but new shoots from things like Dracaena or Croton are often cut off and rerooted in the sand to form new individuals. Cuttings of leaves is also a possible way to propagate new plants. We talked about that a little bit earlier, but a little more detail on that. Because the leaf cuttings don't include an axillary bud or a node, they can be used only for plants that are capable of forming adventitious buds off of the leaf. Not all plants can be propagated this way. Leaf cuttings are used almost exclusively for propagating quite a few indoor plants. There's several types of leaf cuttings. There's a leaf cutting with a petiole, leaf without a petiole, leaf bud, and split leaf cutting. We talked about that in a previous lecture regarding begonias and African violets. That can be, you can take a leaf and turn it over and nick or cut open the veins on the leaf and then put that bottom side down, that leaf, onto some media, and roots can form out of those cuts. A little bit more on leaf cuttings. Um, Here's some examples of what you can do to take the leaf petiole cutting. You're taking a leaf with its petiole. The petiole is the stem that's attached to the leaf that attaches that leaf to the stem or the branch of whatever plant you're talking about. And you would just insert the petiole into the media, and that is where roots will form, and sometimes new plants, new little baby leaves, and a whole new plant will come. That leaf that you cut withers away over time and a whole new plant grows. An interesting example of a leaf cutting is in jade plant or Crassula ovata. If you take these leaves from a jade plant and root them, they will form roots. But if you didn't get any of the basal tissue, the tissue of the stem that leaf was attached to, it won't develop any more leaves or branches. So you'll get a leaf from a jade plant that has roots, and it will stay alive just as a leaf with roots. It won't grow anything new. So that doesn't really work. You need some of the base tissue. And cuttings from leaves without petioles. The examples shown in the images are Sansevieria, and that is also called snake plant. It's propagated from just taking sections of the leaves, cutting sections of them and sticking them vertically in media, and they will grow. Leaf bud cuttings are described in this slide. It's a very specialized method of using leaf cuttings where a leaf, some of the basal tissue of that leaf, and a bud is included in the cutting, and that is put in the media and used to propagate a new plant. You probably won't be doing this in this class, but if you do become a propagator in the future, you'll be using a variety of techniques. Certain species respond to certain types of propagation methods, and I brought up this one because it is the main way that Camellia sinensis is propagated, and that's the Camellia species that all teas come from. Black, green, white tea are all made from Camellia sinensis, and this is the method, a leaf bud cutting, that they use to propagate those plants. As mentioned previously, a split vein cutting is done with a leaf and nicking the main leaf veins and then laying that leaf lower side down on the media and keeping it there until roots form out of those nicks. And then each of those little areas that was cut and roots form out, they can be cut off of that leaf. So in the image, you could get 5 new plants from this one begonia leaf. a little bit about the propagation environment for cuttings. So the controlled environment is needed to encourage that cut organ to regenerate the missing parts. The first thing we want our environment to promote in that cutting is the growth of adventitious roots off of the stem tissue or the leaf tissue or root tissue. We don't want it to grow leaves first because those leaves need water and they lose water through transpiration, and they would have no way to bring water in unless there were roots. So roots first, and that's why we use bottom heat and rooting hormone. And then after the roots are established, we then change the environment a little to encourage more stem and leaf growth. So a lot of light and nutrients are not needed until the roots are formed, and then we can give it a little bit more light and nutrients to increase the production of stems and leaves. Greenhouses, cold frames, heated enclosed cases and areas are what we want our cuttings to be in. And within the right conditions, perennials propagated by cuttings can grow and flower within the next following year. A little bit more on the environment for propagating cuttings. Our cuttings, we want the bottom of the cuttings to be warm, so we'll use heating mats or heating tubes underneath the flats or trays or pots that we're putting the cuttings in. About 68 to 77 degrees Fahrenheit is good to promote adventitious root growth. Misty middles, we want the whole environment that their roots are in, that the cuttings are in, to be humid. So you can keep plants in a plastic bag, have misting system, keep them in a greenhouse with a swamp cooler, something that will keep the whole atmosphere and environment humid. But we also want that humidity to be moving. We want the air that is humid to be moving around. So ventilation, fans, some shading to keep them cool. Those are all important aspects of the propagation environment to increase the success of rooting of your stem cuttings. Balmy bottoms, misty middles, and cool crowns. Little example of media, and you'll learn more about this in the lab, but the media needs to be able to support the cutting physically. If it's a big cutting, media has to be pretty firm to hold it up. Has to be clean environment, sterile, has to retain water, but not hold on to the water too much. Has to be well aerated and well draining as addition to water retaining. You can use peat, grit, perlite, sand, vermiculite, pumice, lots of different things that are used to make your rooting media where you put the cuttings directly into. Often in our class, we use 100% perlite, and that's just those little white balls that you see in potting soil. They hold on to some moisture, but they never keep the stem cutting sitting in water, in which case it would rot. And protect those cuttings. You want to keep them sheltered in that humid environment, so protection from desiccation. As we said before, the bottom heat will increase the rooting. Once they get roots and leaves, they can slowly be hardened off, and that is a process by which we get the plant used to less water, less humidity, and more light in getting that plant ready for outdoor living.